Tiffin Talks, to yet another edition. We have Pallavi Aiyar today, who's I don't know where all she's been as a foreign correspondent. She's been to Jakarta, she's been in Japan, she's been in Brussels, she's been in Beijing, and of course, she studied in London. So I think she's possibly, as she was just saying, the most peripatetic of people that we've had so far on Tiffin Talks. I'm delighted to have her. And I love her cheeky and a very sort of irreverent style in whatever she writes, whether it's non-fiction or fiction. So it's such a pleasure to have Pallavi here with me. Although I must confess, I'm a dog person, not a cat person. But welcome, Pallavi, to Tiffin Talks.
Thank you so much, Kaveree. On my screen, I appear to have frozen, and so does everybody else. But am
No,
I?
we're
Am I?
fine.
We
Yes.
fine. Okay,
Yes.
that's brilliant. So thank you so much. I'm really excited to talk to you today about the new book, Jakarta Tails. Here we
Yes.
are. Look at the cover.
And I must also tell you that she's in Madrid right now. So
Yes.
yet another sort of
Yeah.
stamp on her passport. So, Pallavi, I have to start not with Jakarta's tale so much, although we
Sure.
will get to it, but really, you've been across half the world now, and you're in the middle of the pandemic in Spain, which has been one of the really major centers of the pandemic, last year. How has it really changed the world, you think?
Fundamentally, I mean, it's changed the way that we learn. It's changed the way that we work. It's changed the way that, obviously, the way that we travel. The very fact that, we are all here in different time zones talking to each other about a book set in Jakarta, with me in Spain, with you in New Delhi, and goodness knows where our audience is from.
Yeah.
We've kind of seen, in some ways, the resurgence of the importance of space with the importance of borders and so on, but also the annihilation of space and the ability of technologies to kind of just really take us into multiple spaces at the same time. I think what we've really seen is an acceleration of trends that were already underway for quite a long time. Ever since the internet was something that was invented and became widespread, like internet enthusiasts were predicting that this would be the way that work, play, leisure, everything would be conducted. And I think what we've really seen in the last year is the acceleration of this. And I don't think that we're going to quite go back to how it was. We might see, obviously, some reining back once the vaccination is more widespread. But this is going to be quite epochal, I have a feeling. And unfortunately, also just the way that we react to strangers, I hope that that's not something that that remains constant going forwad. But at the moment, I feel that we've become so cautious of other people or people that we don't know. And so much of my life, you mentioned earlier this peripatetic lifestyle. It's been about striking up conversations with
Right.
strangers, on a bus, on a train, sitting at a restaurant or in a cafe and talking to somebody else. And just this kind of, these moments of serendipity where you come across somebody, you start chatting, and that leads to entire whole new worlds. And for me, that's been the biggest disadvantage or, drawback of the pandemic. The fact that now when we go out, we're behind masks, we're
Yeah.
signaling to everybody that we are not open for business. They're signaling the same for us. We actually kind of take a little detour every time we come to crowds. And there's a great reluctance to kind of talk to strangers or just reach out for human contact in that situation. So I really hope that that is something that does change. So while I'm excited for the possibilities that technology has opened up, I remain slightly worried about that aspect of just basic human contact and reaching out.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, Pallavi. I was reading an interview that you'd done some time ago, and you talked about the idea of space as you saw it, when you were growing up in New Delhi and then when you went abroad, the way you saw space changed. And I found that quite fascinating. You want to talk about how you see this idea of privacy and space now?
Yeah,
There was a
that's
very
interesting.
interesting incident that you mentioned about how you just picked up a Cheetos from a friend's packet, and he was aghast that you'd done it without asking him.
One of the sort of great connections I've always felt between India and countries like China.
Hmm.
And people often feel that China is India's other and it's so inscrutable
Right,
and so
right.
different from us. But I think one thing that was quite similar, and that sort of really struck me, was the similarity of how we occupy space,
Yeah.
and our conceptions of where the lines are between where our space begins and somebody else's begins, and how sacrosanct or not those lines
Yeah.
are. And of course, some of this has to just do with being very crowded developing
Yeah.
countries, but I also think it has to do with situations where you've kind of got cities where the village lives in cities and they have not urbanized to the extent as
Completely. Yeah.
many sort of Western societies have. So you've still got bits of that village culture that exist even in so-called anonymous urban contexts, where you address everybody in a familial way as auntie or
Yeah.
uncle or bhaiya or didi, nani in India, and the equivalents in China would be, shushu, ai. The equivalents in Indonesia, which I use in the book as well as honorifics, are pak and ibu. Pak is like basically means father, but you call all older men father, and
Right.
all older ladies ibu or bu, which is
Right.
mother. So you see this across Asia, and similarly the idea of sharing. Like I think in any of these countries, it would be unconscionable for people to kind of sit down with their bag of chips and eat it while there's
Yeah.
people around them,
Exactly. You
and
would
not
just
think
pass
about
it around.
offering it.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's just whether you know them or not, and even if you're on a bus or a train, you would end up doing that. We've all grown up with that, right? And
Absolutely.
that's something you would see in China as well. Like if you went to a bus in the countryside, the peasants, they would have the oranges and boiled eggs that you'd see in India also, and people would share that, crack nuts, and
Right.
that's how you kind of bond with strangers. Again, that's a class thing, and it starts changing the more
Yeah.
higher up you
Yeah.
go on the class hierarchy, and also the more urbanized you get. But anyway, I mean, I think the biggest shock was kind of going to Europe and I studying, for example, in England as I did. I think that's the example that you mentioned of
Yeah.
sort of unreflexively reaching out to a classmate. I mean, this is not a complete stranger. This is
Yeah.
somebody that not a classmate, a college mate, somebody that was in the same college, and we were sitting in the college middle common room and talking. And, I remember him eating a bag of chips. And so I sort of reached out for one. And he was genuinely, miffed by the fact that I didn't ask or whatever. And not just that, I mean, we're so casual, right? Like, again, I remember kind of growing up and just putting my foot up on somebody's car to tie my shoelace or
Yeah.
something. Like in the UK, the alarm of the car would start going off. you know you've done something terrible. So yeah, you have to kind of relearn those boundaries of
Right.
space, obviously. And yeah, and I think that the pandemic is going to be very interesting in
Yeah.
how it draws those boundaries anew.
Yeah.
And this time not only in the West, but it's a global situation that we're all facing. I haven't been in India, for example, at all during 2020, but I'm wondering how so it affects that or not, either. I don't know. I suspect that there will be a shift
Yeah.
to some extent
I think so.
in
I
how we
think
all
there will
see
be. I
space.
think there will be a permanent shift. But Palvi, let's come to Jakarta Tales. No, actually, before that, let me go to Chinese Whiskers, because in Chinese Whiskers, you, in a sense, talk about the virus, which really did,
Isn't
we,
that strange? I mean,
isn't that,
completely not
I,
calculated, but
I
yes.
mean, just imagine, that
Yeah.
was written when? In 20,
2010.
right.
And yeah. But even
So,
earlier than that, sorry, Kaveri, finish your question,
no,
please.
so I was thinking, here you were talking about the virus and, the blame being put on the cats for that virus in Chinese Whiskers 10 years before it actually hit all of us. So in a way, you're the Steven Soderbergh of fiction. Uh, so talk a bit about that. How was it that you wrote about this?
So it wasn't just Chinese Whiskers. My first book was Smoke and Mirrors, which
Right,
I wrote in 2007. It was published in 2008.
right.
And the third chapter of that book was titled Coronavirus.
God,
And
really?
isn't that bizarre? It's spooky. So when, of course, coronavirus entered mainstream vocabulary in February this last year, 2020, I had various people revisiting it and posting it and, kind of almost making me out to be some kind of Nostradamus. How did she know?
Yeah,
Like, but of course, it's because SARS was a
right,
coronavirus, right?
right.
And I lived in China. I moved to China just a few months before the SARS virus broke out. out, and it was how I kind of actually ended up being a print journalist. My very first dispatches for newspapers were about SARS. That was the first topic I covered. And I was quarantined in a Chinese university in Beijing at the time. So I was writing from the front lines, and yeah, it was a sort of very epochal moment in my life, because it kind of it formed me as a journalist. It was also, there was a lot of public health lying. I mean, there was mixed messages, there was lying by the government. There was the use of technology, which was quite new at the time, of text messages, which fascinated me. I had just finished my master's degree on mobile telephony and how that affects users' perception of space and time. And then suddenly I was seeing the role of text messages in spreading all these rumors, and then also the government trying to reassert its own narrative, from the health ministry sending out SMSs every day. So all of this was fascinating. I remember seeing the masks for the first time, people on the streets in masks, and I remember saying that they looked like manic surgeons on the loose. How was I to know that 20 years later I would be one? I mean, the whole world is like that, right? But SARS, of course, disappeared quite quickly. But again, animals were very central to the whole narrative of SARS, because, eventually they pinned it on civet cats, and sort of the eating of wild civet cats. As one of the main conduits for how the virus jumped from wildlife to the human population. But for many months, there were rumors about it being all cats. There were rumors about it being dogs, and we had horrific stories of people throwing their pets off from, the 10th floor of a balcony or whatever, just to kind of get rid of them, because they were worried that they would be infected. And then you also had these gangs of vigilantes who were roaming the streets and rounding up stray animals or even pet animals if they were unattended, and taking them off to a nefarious end. And I remember on the streets, there were these huge posters that went up, which were very strange, which had cats on a plate. So there was a plate, and there was a fork and knife, or chopsticks, might have been chopsticks, I can't remember, and a cat, and then a kind of, verboten not allowed sign that was slashed across them in red, indicating do not eat the cats, because they thought, but so all of this was going on. And later in 2006, I became a pet owner myself. My husband and I decided to practice for parenthood by adopting two alley cats. And when I ended up
perfect animal to adopt when you want to have children. Children are
dogs,
exactly like that.
Yeah, but
dogs are too loyal.
Too long. Yes, there's this kind of take that cats do, isn't it? Yeah, and so when I ended up thinking about Chinese Whiskers and thinking about how I would integrate cats into a larger narrative, which I also wanted to be a political narrative, not overtly political, because I wanted it to be for all ages, and I also wanted it to be for all interests, not just for policy wonks or whatever. I thought, the SARS crisis, the idea of a virus, would be a good plot point as a way of getting one of the cats kidnapped and hence, out into the wider city. So yeah, that's how it all came about. It was not some great act of prediction. It was only looking at what I had experienced and writing about it. But of course, we came full circle, and yeah, we're back to coronavirus 2.0, unfortunately.
Yeah, but quite fascinating that, obviously if you're a good reporter, you keep your eyes and ears open, you become like you, and you tend to predict what the world is going to end up like. That's quite fascinating. Talk a little about Jakarta Tales and why you situated soyabean and tofu in Jakarta. Was it just because you happened to be there, or was it also that Indonesia is going through a very fundamental change?
Yeah, so I was in Indonesia.
Yeah.
So I was in Indonesia for 4 years, between 2012 and 2016, which was a very fundamental period in Indonesian history, and I'll get to that. But I think what blew me away about being in Indonesia, many things did. One was just how, given its size and strategic influence, it was possibly the most sort of underappreciated, invisible country in the world.
Yeah,
there are 260 million citizens. It was the world's fourth most populous nation. It was its third largest democracy. It was spread over 17,000 islands. And I read somewhere that if it was superimposed end to end on the map of Europe, the archipelago would span the distance from Ireland all the way to the Caspian Sea.
Wow.
And what also struck me was its incredible diversity and plurality. I always thought of India as somehow being quite unique in how plural and diverse it was and in what it was trying to do as a nation.
Right.
And then I suddenly saw all of these parallels with Indonesia that I had not known about. About 88% of Indonesians self-identify as Muslims, which makes it the country home to the largest Islamic population in the world. But the state also officially recognized 5 other religions: Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and it split Christians into Protestants and Catholics.
Exactly.
So you had this, and then you had this very like just a lot of. I mean, they seemed like doppelgangers of each other.
Right.
Indonesia was neck to neck with India on virtually every social indicator. We tend to compare India and China a lot, and I've done the same. But in many ways, it's like comparing an apple with an orange. They are very different in their timber. They are very different in their history. They are very different in the choices that they've made as modern nation states, and very different in the sense of their political systems, and just their temperament. I feel as countries. But I felt that India and Indonesia were like twins. Just the national motto of Indonesia is unity in diversity. Like us, and it's actually a Sanskrit phrase. The phrase in Bahasa Indonesia is Bhineka Tinggal Ika.
Okay.
Bhineka, multiple but one. Ika,
One.
one, right?
Right.
I think it really underscores the accomplishment of both the states, as well as the challenge of both the states,
Right.
which is of weaving together a kind of unified tapestry out of what is immense plurality.
Right.
And I covered the elections there both in 2012 and 2014. I think 2014 was the same as our election. So Modi and
Yeah.
Jokowi were basically, I think, 1 month apart.
Yeah. That's
And, looking at the noisy rallies, the demanding trade unionists, the free and assertive press,
right.
again, very similar, very, very similar. And the main challenges were the same: deep-seated corruption, infrastructural lacunae, yawning inequalities, the need for governments to enact economic reform that was often unpopular,
Right.
harnessing this so-called demographic dividend to
Which we
productive
hear about
use.
all the time. Yeah.
Right. But I think the most important was also this respecting of pluralism and fighting against religious intolerance
Yeah.
and this idea of a majoritarianism. So you saw that as well, all of those being played out in both countries. I wanted to write about Indonesia, and the cats again just seemed an interesting way to be able to bring many of these issues to light. The fake news, I mean, we were
Fake
talking about the
news.
power of
Yes.
technology earlier as well. And, Indonesia was a huge front runner with Twitter, and it was, I think, one of the nations which had the largest number of Twitter users in the world. And,
Right.
everybody was using it, even when I was there quite early in 2012,
Right.
2013. So it's also become a major player in the political landscape.
Right.
And it was used in every election by both camps in nefarious ways. So, fake news has become a huge thing in Indonesia, similar to in India. You've had these mobs going around, you've had rumors of uh, um,
Yeah.
vaccinations,
Child
for
theft
example,
and yeah, all
child theft.
vaccination.
Very similar,
Yeah.
very similar, and also used to kind of mobilize extremist elements to kind of come and protest at key moments
Right.
against blasphemy, in support of blasphemy laws and things like that as well. So like when I wrote Chinese Whiskers, I thought about what are the kind of defining issues in China that I was interested in, and corruption was one of them. And I guess the physical landscape of the city and how it was changing, because we saw Beijing being built anew for the Olympic Games. So I wanted to
Right.
bring those two things in, which become very major things for Chinese Whiskers. And also the generation gap, I think, was another big one, because you've seen the society so wrenched between generations,
Right.
huge changes. And in Indonesia, for me, I think the most important thing was, the fact that its diversity and its pluralism was in some ways being threatened over the last few years, and then seeing the use of technology as well. So I kind of make fake news as the and
Yeah.
pluralism as the linchpin of this novel. What
Right.
kind of grounds it, the plot. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because you're actually writing a political novel, but it's just that it's through these two
It's
cats.
interesting, right? I don't, yeah, I didn't, it's hard to kind of, put it in any kind of genre, because I didn't think of it as when I'm writing. Generally, I don't tend to really think of genres. I tend to kind of write
Right.
because I'm
Yeah.
moved to write at that point of
Right.
view, and it kind of runs away with you and you get into it. But yes, so is it a children's book? Is it an adult book? Is it a political book? Is it a funny book? Is it satire? Is it a fable? It's hard to kind of give it a label, but I hope it's an interesting story, and with great characters that's absorbing and you learn something as well.
Yeah.
That would really be the ultimate aim of it.
Absolutely. So, Pallavi, I mean, it's amazing. You're so prolific. I don't know how many books you've written. What is
A
it,
few,
10?
five, no, we're six,
Yeah.
yeah, with one
So,
more coming out.
yeah. So is it that, every place you go to just sort of sets you off right away? And I was reading again about the way you take notes, and, it could be anywhere. You could be sitting on a bus, you could be wherever, but, you're always sort of mentally, or I don't know how you take notes. In fact, talk about that. How do you sort of observe and, uh, sort of record what you see? Because it's such diverse experiences.
So I think, Kaveri, I have a feeling that you probably experience things in a similar way, given that you are a writer and a journalist, and which is that,
I
like,
don't have so much diversity though to observe.
perhaps, yeah, and I think that does make a difference, because I think every time you're in a new environment,
Ah,
there is about a 6-month window
hmm.
when you really see. And when I say you really see, I mean your eyes are open,
Yeah.
and
In
you're
fact,
drinking it in.
you talk about that somewhere, Pallavi, when you say that your eyes really open wide and you're sort of just taking everything in, and then
So what happens
slowly
is,
the eyes
exactly,
shrink. Yeah,
exactly, and this happens every country. I've noticed
right.
that there's usually a 6-month window when I say when I'm observing, I mean I'm not just looking at signposts, I'm reading the
Yeah,
signposts. I'm not just observing people. I mean, when I'm sitting in a metro, I'm not just looking at my phone. I'm trying actively to notice what people are doing. What are
right,
they reading? What
right.
are they talking about? If they're speaking on the phone, I'm a hopeless eavesdropper. I actually even kind of listen, even if I can't hear the words. It's about intonation and body language.
Yeah,
If I'm walking on the streets, I look at the manhole covers, and so what can they tell you? I don't know. Everything is fodder for
right,
a brief period of time before it normalizes. And before it normalizes, I also feel it sparks a lot of comparison. You're immediately comparing it constantly to what is your norm at that point. Then
right.
at some point it becomes your norm. It becomes yet another norm. You acquire one more normality in your life. But initially, there is this period, I feel that the whole body, all the senses are just much more attuned to what's going on. And I try to drink it. I actually end up using Facebook a lot for that. It becomes like a recorded diary almost, of just little aphorisms that pop into the head, photographs, photographic recollection or diary of what's going on as well. So it can be quite useful. But I like all journalists, I think, beyond that, I tend to just experience my life and people as narratives in some extent. Like, when I talk to you or whenever anything happens, I kind of tend to think of it as a story. I don't know, it gets translated into a story,
Story.
uh,
Yeah,
into my head. There's a narrative structure to my life that
yeah,
I'm sort of experiencing my life like that,
yeah,
including a lot of the lows and or the
yeah.
bad things that happen. I mean, I remember when we arrived in Brussels, when we moved to Brussels from China in 2009, at the airport about
Hmm.
15 minutes after arriving, with a 7-month-old and two cats, the same cats that are the protagonists in both the books, and all of this. I got robbed at the airport. I lost everything, and of course, it became the opening of my book on Europe, which was called
Yeah,
Punjabi Parmesan. But this is what I mean. Like,
yeah,
even these terrible things, they
yeah.
become part of what happened, and why. And then you think about why it happened. You kind of try to investigate a little bit. So it's how I experience life, and why I love life, actually, because everything is interesting,
It's
and
a story.
everybody is interesting. I think more than even everything, people are interesting, and we tend to often dismiss people, because they're, I don't know, they're not as educated, or they're not as articulate, or they're not as whatever, they have weird views that you don't agree with, or they're bucks, or they're whatever. I mean, there's a lot of people we dismiss for a whole variety of reasons. But
Yeah.
I just feel, and I always have felt, that there's show me a boring person, and it's very rare. Even like the most boring person on the surface is probably hiding quite an interesting story somewhere and has a rich inner life. And the same for places. I don't dislike anywhere. People keep asking me,
Right.
what is your favorite place? And the normal expat reaction to anywhere is misery and complaining. Like, I have been with expats in every country,
Oh, yes.
western, eastern, and no matter where they are moaning. And so I realized it's really not the place. It's just a kind of I don't know, it's almost like a hobby, to kind of complain that it's not like back home, wherever that is. And but you can also make it the hobby the other way. It really is about attitudes. There is something fascinating about everywhere.
Absolutely.
And I think I'm lucky in that I just tend to experience things like that. It's not even that much hard work.
Right.
It's a natural tendency.
So I think, as Nora Ephron said, everything is copy at the end of the day, which is,
True.
yeah, and you have to be blessed to look at things that way. I think, it's for some people it just comes naturally. I
More
wanted to
easily,
ask
yeah.
you, but I wanted to ask you because you said somewhere that if you had to base this kind of novel in Delhi, your protagonist would not be cats, but maybe a ghost or a god.
I
I
think that
found
was in
that,
a Granta piece. Yeah.
yeah, but isn't
I
that
wonder why I said
fascinating?
that. You're going to ask me, aren't you?
Obviously,
I'm
I'm
going
going
to have to
to
come
ask
up
you.
with some reason.
But
I think that what I
fascinating.
meant by that was,
Yeah,
the Delhi is it's too personal for me. India is very personal for me.
right,
And the writing about China, writing about Indonesia through the cats is fine, because I can kind of there's a sort of light-hearted vein that's running through
right.
it. Because it's animals, and it's cute animals, and they have personalities. One is very arch, and one is sort of worried but wise. And but that would kind of, I think for India it would not work for me, because it would need something that's deeper and more painful. I would find it harder to write about it in a lighter vein. And I think that's what I was kind of trying to sort of say when I was saying that would be a ghost or a god. There's something bigger
Yeah.
about it for me. Yeah.
Pallavi, I think, let's also talk about the idea of writing as a working mom, because you're
Yeah.
constantly, I think, especially the pandemic has brought home this whole double burden even more so because men have finally realized the kind of work it takes to run a home.
Have they? I
And
don't know.
I don't think they've done anything about it, but I think at least they've sort of seen that it does take a lot of work to run the home. So, what is it like to, have babies and bylines, as your book says?
Yeah, it's a bit easier now that my boys are older, but I think it's a fundamental break. I will give you a story. I mean, okay, going back. When I married, and I think this is true for a lot of young women and men today who are young and in college and are urban and are educated and feel that in some ways all of these battles of sexism and so on have been won, and we
Haha,
have
they
more or
don't
less
know.
of an equal playing field. And no, and I think they seriously believe it, and I think they do have a level playing field compared to 40 years ago when it comes
Yeah,
to education and when it comes to opportunities in college. I mean, things have leveled a lot more, and I think often they will find life partners who are very well intentioned and who identify as feminists, and they go into this relationship which is a blissful relationship. They both have careers, and everybody's encouraging of each other, and possibly whatever work they do at home is split and all of that. And I think I had that experience to quite a large extent. I think what really changed everything was babies. Yeah. So pre-babies, post-babies was two completely different things for various reasons. Part of it is just physical. It is the mother who is having the pregnancy. It is the
yeah.
mother who is going through all of that. It is the mother who then has to go through all the breastfeeding dramas and so on. So there's a physical, biological aspect to it, which is very different. And I think a lot of us, there's not much focus on that because we focus so much on stressing the sameness rather than the differences,
Right.
that it can come as a rude shock. to a certain kind of person. But more than that, I think the big difference was really driven home to me, and this is an anecdote in the book, and I will name, not shame, because there's no shame in this. This is just the way it is. I will name my experience with a male writer about 3 months after I'd had my first child. The writer was Pankaj Mishra.
Mm.
And the story goes, I had a very difficult birth, and I had a very difficult child. My first child was somebody who cried, 16 hours a day for the first 4 months, had extreme colic, and was not sleeping at all. And it was extremely, it was a huge shock for me. Like my life had just kind of come tumbling down, and it was a very big news time. It was like the end of 2008. You had Lehman Brothers collapse, you had Obama get elected. I mean, everything you could imagine in the world was happening, and I was sort of vaguely aware of what was going on. We had the terror attacks in
Yeah.
Bombay, all of that.
Bombay.
And all I was doing at that time was trying to pump milk, and it was not coming. There wasn't sufficient milk, and I was going to these La Leche League meetings and having breastfeeding experts coming to stare at my breasts and squeeze them and tell me about latches, and I was just constantly thinking, what have I done? And this is my life. And I was just in a complete tizzy, and I wasn't really able to leave the house much because I thought Ishan, my older child, was so cranky that if I left him with anybody, they'd throw him out of the window. I mean, little realizing that actually he affected other people far less than he affected me. But at the time I was just like, no, this is, nobody else will be able to handle him.
Handle him.
So this was going on, and at that some point I got a call from a writer friend in Beijing who said that, oh, I'm having a dinner and there's Pankaj Mishra is in town, and would you like to come and meet him? And I was so excited because he was a big hero of mine.
Yeah.
And I said, yeah, I'll try. And I put the phone down, and I was crying and saying, I really want to go, but how can I go? And my husband stepped up very nicely and said that, no, you go and I'll handle him. We had a nanny as well. And so we went into this big preparation of me, pumping and pumping and pumping to have 1.5 bottles ready, because I was producing very little milk, so I could go for this dinner. And I went for the dinner, had a very nice time, although I kept feeling like I felt a bit like on the verge of an exam, when your stomach is like something was
Yeah.
wrong, you don't
Something
feel
is wrong.
totally
Yeah.
normal. And I couldn't really be completely normal, but it was fine. Although I didn't feel I could stay for very long. And just towards the end of the meeting, Pankaj Mishra came up to me and said, would you like to have a cup of coffee next week? I'm in Beijing for a week. I was so excited. Oh my God, Pankaj Mishra wants to have coffee with me. And I was like, yeah, I'll be there. But in my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, the breast pumping, how am I going to prepare for this? So anyway, when we went back, we went into another 1 week of preparation for my meeting with Pankaj for tea. And more milk was put in the fridge, and the nanny was prepared, everybody was prepared, and I go off to have tea with Pankaj, very excited. And while we were talking, I discovered that he had a child exactly the same age as mine, and he was swanning around Asia on a tour, and had been, was going to be in China for the next 1 month. And for me to have tea for half an hour required this
Had to
1 week
prepare for a week.
preparation,
Yeah.
right? And I think it was at that moment that I just realized this huge, enormous gulf.
Yeah.
And that gulf was there, and it's a fact. And since then I have basically written in the snatches and the pauses that are available to me, and I don't resent that, because that is the way it is. And I love my children, and I've had a fantastic, and they became fodder for a book, like I told you. Baby
Yeah.
Sankaran, poor Ishan, all his colic was described in great excruciating detail over 3 chapters.
Yeah. He won't thank you for it much
He's
later.
not, poor chap. He and my little one, they keep thinking that they are heroes of the book, because it's called Babies and Bylines, and it's dedicated to them. So they keep thinking I've written a book about them, this glorious book. But yeah, I think one day they're in for a rude shock. Uh,
Yeah, but that's the thing. You have to write, as you said, you have to work in the pauses. And you have a wonderful line about that. The relief from stress to access the imagination. I think I like that a lot. The idea that you really have to make an effort to do that. But I mean, this is the choice we make, but I think we don't talk about it and we don't write about it often enough. So the experience doesn't get translated to as many people as it should. Do you feel that as women, we sort of tend to shy away from the hard work that life really is?
Absolutely. I think it's a very complicated thing. Like, on the one hand, people don't talk too much about it because they don't. I think there's almost a sense of not wanting to discourage others.
Procreation.
Really, I think there's some kind of biological. Like, my mother never told me. I
Yeah.
mean, it was never.
Her
It was
mother's
always.
right there. She's
Oh my
smiling
gosh.
away.
Is she? Okay. I mean, it's kind of like, oh, you must have a baby. It'll be so wonderful, right? And nobody says, there is a kind of reluctance to talk about it. But partly, I also think because it's just not seen as something that's very important.
Yeah.
Domestic housework is an interior thing that stays within the forehouse of the world. It doesn't make newspaper headlines. It's not seen as something that has great importance to society as much as, say, agricultural laws, or the policy making, or those are the things that kind of tend to make headlines. And the quotidian, the everyday, which is woman's work, is
Yeah.
not really been politicized. It's not something that's seen as something that is part of a public conversation. So
Hmm.
you have various private conversations going on around it, between friends, perhaps between families or whatever, but it doesn't, that private is interior. It doesn't really become part of a more public conversation. And so, yeah, I think there's that. And then I also think that to some extent it's also the feminism and the feminist movement, which has focused so much on work, on women working, and not that much on child rearing, and the more domestic parts of what it is, of what life is like. I mean, I feel like I went to school, I went to college, I could do everything. I could do maths, I could do science, I could read literature, but I could not sew, I could not cook. No one had taught me about how to change a diaper. But somebody does all this stuff, but it's not, it's almost like considered as something that's not important,
Hmm.
even by women of a certain kind. Whereas I think all of this, like these domestic chores, or the act of caring, is something that's important for men and women, and it's not something that's not important, and only science and literature and so on is of value. So it's about how we value things. And I think all of this is just seen as really down to nannies can do it,
Yeah.
which is
That's what that's
ridiculous.
what that's what I like about your work, Pallavi. It manages to bring the domestic and the public domain together. And I think that is what is important, because you're able to write about what is traditionally thought of as women's writing, as well as the policy writing, and you're able to do that together and do that wonderfully and blend it. But you often feel that there is a sort of superciliousness towards women's writing, or writing about the domestic sphere, that still exists.
Yeah, of course, the whole idea of chicklit, or
Yeah.
rom-com, and
Or
how we can
catlit.
be so dismissive, or catlit, or even about parenting or babies. I mean, a book like Babies and Bylines, I don't think, I don't have the figures, but I doubt many men went to a bookstore and picked it up. Although it was not really just about women, it was a woman as a protagonist, me, but I was talking about issues that affect parents and coupledom and marriages.
Yeah.
But I think it remains very gendered as something that's not serious. No, it's the kind of what I was saying earlier
Yeah.
about what it is that is supposed to be part of the public discourse, which is kind of lofty and above that of the
Exactly.
family and the home. Whereas, of course, the family and the home is the most intensely political space.
Absolutely.
But we tend to not see it like that.
I also wanted to ask you, Pallavi. I was just watching The White Tiger, the movie adaptation of the book, and it ends with this line where the driver, as you know, who eventually becomes an entrepreneur, who says that the next century belongs to the brown and the yellow man, to the brown man and the yellow man, and I wonder, and the white man should move on. I wonder what you think of it, considering you've been in all, in both the white nations as well as the brown and the yellow nations. What do you think of that?
The yellow band be winning. No, I mean, on a serious on a serious note, I think that certainly we're seeing a relative decline of power in Europe,
Yeah.
and
And you've
the
written
white
about this.
The white world, yeah. So
Yeah.
we're seeing a kind of global adjustment that's been going on. But I think it's a huge exaggeration to kind of call that as the Asian century, or as somehow that is eclipsed. That you can forget about the West. I mean, this is a balancing, and we're certainly not at any kind of balanced level. I
Right.
also think that it's mistaken to lump Asia together.
Hmm.
And when you're looking at, say, China, and when you're looking at India, we are talking about very different trajectories, and we're talking about a very different list of achievements. I feel particularly bad for India because I think China's social and economic achievements were always far ahead of India's. What India had to be proud of was its political achievement, and its political achievement was in finding this kind of unified tapestry out of diversity, and
Right.
finding a model where you could deal with plurality, which remains China's problem, its weak spot, as it were. It also has plurality, but it has not figured out
Right.
how to allow that plurality to flourish, and therefore it remains brittle politically, I believe. However, I mean, if you look at human development indicators, and you look at anything from maternal mortality to female literacy to sewer systems, and access to health and sanitation, and so on. I mean, China is on another planet
Yeah.
to India, and so I think the basic life for an average Chinese person is far ahead of somewhere like India. And also look at air pollution, which is something I've also written
That you've
about.
written about and choked. Yeah.
Yes, in Choked. Beijing had an average AQI of something like I think 75 in last year, which is amazing. When I was there, it used to be something like 200, which is where Delhi is right now. So it's made huge strides in being able to also improve the environment. It has become one of the global leaders in green technologies.
Hmm.
All of the environmental destruction that it kind of went through, which it did, just like Europe also went through, and other countries that have industrialized have also gone through, it has been able to kind of get through that phase. And so I mean, and so far it has proven politically resilient. They are very clever. I mean, I myself have my doubts about the Xi Jinping model
Hmm.
going forward, but it is not, there's certainly no sort of imminent collapse of China. We had Western commentators who were writing from 2002 onwards about the coming collapse of China. There's a man called Gordon Chang who's
Yeah.
quite famous for having said that. And
But
there's
it
a lot
has
of
still not
memes
come.
coming, a lot of memes about the China collapsing in 100 years, and Gordon coming out of the grave with his hands saying, "I was ahead of the curve." But yeah, so I mean, China might collapse or might not at some point, but it's certainly more resilient than a lot of commentators gave it
Hmm.
credit for over the last couple of decades. And I don't think we're seeing any imminent collapse of China. So yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing a rebalancing. We're certainly seeing a shift east. We're also seeing Southeast Asia emerge as another focal point. South Korea, we know, has
Right.
done wonderfully well. Japan struggling, and I think Japan is more on the European end of
Yeah.
somewhere that's got a kind of
But
depressed
but
trajectory.
India's overrated, isn't it?
Overrated. I've always felt it was overrated 10 years ago. Now it's really overrated because we have
Absolutely.
so many. I mean, we have not solved anything. So
Nothing.
I would say
We
20 years
possibly
ago,
we
when I
possibly
was in
gone
China,
back. Yeah.
exactly. So 20 years ago, we had, okay, so first you go back to the 1980s when you actually see India ahead of China on certain
Exactly. Yeah.
parameters, infrastructure and so on, for example. Can you imagine our roads were better?
Yeah.
Our railways were better in the 1980s. Anyway, then you come to the 2000s, which is when I was in China, where China had definitely gone ahead of India. But there was some kind of comparison. India was growing at a clip. We had that double-digit
Right.
possibility of growth. Plus, we had all these political achievements and free elections, and we were finding a way forward, a new way forward,
Yeah.
possibly. And we both had similar problems when it came to environment and so on. China has solved those
Yeah.
problems. It is also kind of, when it comes to its economy, it was a very export driven model. It
Mm.
has sort of internalized, and the domestic market has grown hugely. It has been able to grow companies that cater to the domestic market.
Mm.
It is no longer just about providing cheap labor
Right.
at all. It's kind of shifted away from that. It's been able to increase its service economy as well, which was
Right.
something that was a lacuna for that. So it had identified problems, it worked towards them, from the environment to
Right.
the structure of its economy. And these are works in progress. but there has been change in a direction that is on the whole the right direction. And we've not seen that with India.
Not at all. And I think the thing that we were most proud of, pluralism, is certainly under
There's
threat.
pluralism, there's diversity. The other thing that really strikes you is just the livability
Yes.
of Indian cities. And I think that is declining over the last 20 years. Like going to Delhi in 2002 and going to Delhi now, I almost feel like there's a sense of, I mean, it's almost like a dystopia. Everything is, if you really open your eyes and look, what I was telling you earlier about those first 6 months when you're in
Yeah.
a country, we are desensitized. So, we've kind of got used to seeing things and whatever. But I think if I was a foreigner kind of going in there, drinking it all in for the first 6 months, it would be a dystopia.
Right, absolutely. So, really, where are we headed now in the next 10 years? Where do you see? Okay, 10 years is too long. Let's look at the next 2 years for soyabean and tofu. What are they going to be doing?
Yeah,
And what are
I
they going
don't
to be
know.
saying?
I'm wondering if soyabean and tofu might have an outing in Japan, simply because cats are so much, again, part of an integral part of Japanese mythology. And,
Right.
they have a lot of temples that are dedicated completely to cats. I don't know if you've seen that image of the cat that moves. It's the
Yes,
golden
yes.
cat, which is
Yeah,
very Chinese, but it is
yes.
also very Japanese.
Right,
They have a
right.
lot of temples
Yeah,
with that. They have this obsession with cat cafes. Have you heard
yeah.
about cat
Yes,
cafes?
yes.
So cat cafes could be an interesting entry
Way to,
point, couldn't
yeah.
they? And then the other thing was that two things actually with cats in China. One was that there was a lady who fed cats in my neighborhood, and she's such an interesting character. I think she needs to be in a novel. She never spoke. She would only emerge at about midnight. And in the dead of night, she would come with bowls of food, like maybe 20 bowls of food.
Wow.
And if she ever saw me, she would literally cower like this, kind of like melt into the shadows. And she would feed all these cats right outside where I lived, actually. And I tried to find out about what was going on and why she acted like, she was so ashamed of what she was doing. Turned out that it acquires a lot of sanction and censure from the neighbors who don't want people feeding
Oh,
cats. So
right,
it is a kind of almost illicit activity that she was involved in, because they don't want stray cats to be
right.
encouraged or whatever. But she was a very determined activist. And the other story is my Japanese teacher, who was very punctual and punctilious. And one day she cancelled her class first time. And I said, why? And she said it's because she was going to attend a seminar on dental hygiene and cats. And I was just blown away by this. And then she came the next week, and she asked me very seriously about, so how do you brush your cat's teeth? And I was like, I don't. At which point she looked so appalled, and because she was Japanese, she couldn't really show that she was appalled, so she just looked very confused and tried to change the topic. It was hilarious. So there are all these like cat anecdotes, and to me I feel like those are the kind of the flotsam and jetsam of the imagination, where then sometimes I kind of pick and choose from that and try and build a narrative around it. So I'm not there yet at all. But yeah, it's a possibility that there might be a Tokyo edition of soybean and
As
tofu.
long as soyabean and tofu don't end up in food in Japan, I'm fine. We'll see. We'll see at Tokyo Diaries, I suppose. Geetanjali, do you want to ask Pallavi a question? Although I'm
Why
sure.
Gitanjali? She can ask me questions at any time.
Do you want to ask a question?
Kaveree, no, thanks. I do talk to
Hello.
her quite often.
I thought as much. But thank you so much, Pallavi. It was such a pleasure. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I do hope we see more of soyabean and tofu in Tokyo, in Spain, wherever you want to situate them next. Thank you so much for being on Tiffin Talks.
Thank you, Kaveree.
Thank you. Pavan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, Pallavi. Thank you, Kaveree, ma'am.
And
Fantastic,
please,
fantastic.
please do hold up Jakarta Tails once more.
Yeah, please do that.
Yes.
So, guys, please go online. Grab your copy. It looks like a fantastic read. I'm going to do mine.
It's great fun.
We'll definitely do. Thank you so much, Pallavi, for
Thank
joining us on Tiffin Talks,
Thank
guys.
you.
This is live on Facebook on our link on our page, and this will go on YouTube on our channel as well. Please follow us, subscribe to it, and we'll keep bringing these lovely sessions to you in the coming days as well. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great evening.
Thank
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.